How to Calibrate a pH Meter by Ansell, Trieu, and Amiya Ahmed. So what exactly is pH, you might be asking yourself? Well, pH is a measure of the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution. Chemicals that give off these hydrogen ions are said to be acidic, whereas chemicals that accept hydrogen ions are said to be basic. Chemicals that give up all their hydrogen ions and completely dissociate into cations and anions are called strong acids, whereas chemicals that do not fully dissociate are called weak acids. These weak acids have a tendency for some of their anions and cations to rejoin after they have become dissociated. Eventually, the weak acid reaches a point called equilibrium, which is a state where the rate of dissociated acid is equal to the rate at which the acid molecules are formed. There's another solution when it's talking about acids and bases called a buffer. Buffers work by accepting hydrogen ions when they're in excess, and by donating hydrogen ions when there is a lack of them. So now the fun part, how to calibrate a pH meter. Here we have a student who takes the pH meter out of its storage. He puts it into some distilled water to rinse off any excess. He then puts the pH meter into a buffer solution, which has a pH of around 4. He clicks the screen and clicks Calibrate. He then chooses the 2-point calibration system. In the first box, he puts 4. Next, he takes the pH meter out of the solution and puts it into some distilled water to rinse off any excess buffer. Next, he puts the pH meter into a buffer solution which has a pH of around 7. And then he enters 7 into the second box. He then presses OK. He is now ready to read an unknown acid. Here we have some orange juice that will serve as an unknown acid. He puts the pH meter into the unknown, and then we can see that he has a pH of around 3.6. He then goes to his lab notebook and records this pH value. Here's another student who takes the pH meter out of the storage bin and then puts it into some distilled water. Next, he puts the pH meter into a buffer solution that has a pH of around 4, clicks the screen, clicks Calibrate, and then chooses the 2-point calibration method. In the first box, he enters the 4. Next, he rinses the pH meter off with some distilled water and places the pH meter into a buffer solution which has a pH of around 7. He then places the 7 in the second box. He's now ready to read unknown acids. He rinses off his pH meter again and places the pH meter into some orange juice. Again, we can see that the pH of the orange juice has a pH of around 3.6. He then records the pH value in his lab notebook. Once again, we have another student who takes the pH meter out of the storage, places it into some distilled water. He clicks Calibrate on the screen, chooses the 2-point method, and then he puts the pH meter into a buffer solution which has a pH of around 4. In the first box, he puts 4, and then he washes his pH meter off. He then places his pH meter into a buffer solution which has around a pH of 7, and then places the number 7 in the second box. He washes his solution off, and then pushes the pH meter into the orange juice. He's now ready to read, so he reads the solution, waits a little bit, and now we can see that the pH of the orange juice is around 3.66, which he records in his lab notebook.